and we can kind of do some, shareable use cases to each other. So everybody who's joined, thanks for joining. We were just kind of chit-chatting about some stuff with the Marketo release engage notes, but we probably could get started. So thanks for joining. Again, I'm Chelsea Kiko. I am the Director of Marketing Ops at Mcgraw-Hill, and I'm your host today. I'm really excited to kind of hear everybody else answer the questions. I don't have to answer them this time, which is really fun because I can just see everybody else's thoughts. So I'm pumped to be here. So for our agenda, we'll do some intros, some house rules, housekeeping, some upcoming Adobe opportunities, and then we'll have the Q&A panel. One thing I like to make sure is this is supposed to be really conversational. So, make sure that you guys are able to speak up if you want to, ask questions, share your cameras, whatever you guys want to do. We definitely got a lot of good questions already, but I'm happy to take them live as well. So just some house rules here. So we want to make sure that our get-togethers are user-focused and a safe space for everybody. So these are some kind of self-explanatory ones, but we still have to communicate them. Make sure we don't do some self-promotions, don't contact people outside without consent, and make sure that we don't share information without consent here either. Just want to be a safe space for everybody to be able to have a great conversation and learn from each other. So just some quick housekeeping. You've heard the drill before. We're going to be recording this, so you guys will have this afterwards. Some slides will be posted after our conversations today. We'll make sure we have some shareable links of resources that we talked about, and we'll send those out to you guys, which will be really helpful for you guys to continue the conversation. Sometimes it's really hard to answer a question within a couple minutes, so these are going to help you guys do some research of your own. And then through email, you'll get the recording and the updated slides after our conversation today. So here's our champion panel. I'm actually going to do some introductions towards the end of the housekeeping slides here, but I wanted to make sure you guys saw everybody here. We have Jenn, DiMaria, Courtney, Tobe, Carrie, Chandler, and Megan Crone. I will let them do some intros here in a minute. And lastly, just some upcoming opportunities. So join a mug chapter. So for those of you who are not currently involved in your local mug, or you don't even know if there's one near you, feel free to go to this link just to see what mugs are available, and you can join the champion office hours, which is a separate mug where we just all chat about best practices on the champion panel. I highly encourage you guys to also get involved in your local mug too, like I mentioned, because there's a lot of great resources that are shared. A lot of them are virtual right now, which is great because you can kind of join other ones too, not just those local to you. And then lastly, so Marketo Engage certification, there's been a lot of questions around this. So they recently launched a new exam for the Adobe Certified Expert Marketo Engage Business Practitioner Credential. That is the new MCE, if you will. So for those of you who are wanting to become certified, here is a good explanation of both of the exams and kind of what they cover and what is the best fit for you. And then there's more information that I know Amy put in the chat, but also are on these slides if you guys want to go in and explore your certifications, or if any of your certifications are, not updated and you need to keep those up to date. So feel free to reach out with any questions. Okay, so what we'll do now is I'll do some introductions. So I already introduced myself quickly, so I will pass it over to the rest of the panel. If you want to kick it off, Carrie, you guys can do the intros.
Sure. Carrie Chandler. I'm a senior marketing manager at Enact Mortgage Insurance. I've worked with Marketo for about 5 years, and this is my 3rd year as a champion. Jen, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Jenn DiMaria. I'm a marketing operations manager at Telium. I've been working with Marketo since 2012, which makes me feel pretty ancient, and been a champion since about, I think it was 2016 was my first year. So yeah, we don't know what dates are anymore.
I can go. I'm Courtney Tobe. I'm the manager of marketing operations at AppExchange. I've been working in Marketo for 7 years now, so I feel like it's been a while. And I'm a 2-time Marketo champion, and I also got to help write the new MCE exam, so that was a really cool experience.
And my name is Megan Crone. I'm the marketing automation manager at Insight. I've been working in Marketo for about 6 years, just a little over 6 years now. And I am a 2-time champion.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for giving your intro. So we're just going to get straight into the questions. Like I mentioned, we had a lot of great questions that were asked ahead of time, so we'll kind of get started with those. And then anytime you guys have questions, feel free to come off mute, come off your video, or ask those questions in the chat and we'll try to address them. So the first one I have, we mentioned a lot about the champion program, champion office hours. So I think it's great to maybe start with an intro where we had a question from someone in our audience of just information on the champion program in general and how do you apply to become a champion? What's the ins and outs of being involved? So Courtney, would you like to take that question?
Sure. I definitely encourage anyone on this call who's interested in becoming a champion to apply. It's been a wonderful experience. I believe the application process opens up in the fall. Do you guys remember? Yeah, I would say like around it's October or November, I think is when they start opening up the application process. But if you're interested, I suggest just sort of starting to compile a list of all the different ways that you've been an advocate for Marketo over the last year. What are some cool projects you've worked on internally? Have you spoke at any Marketo user groups? Just what are the different ways that you're getting involved and how you're becoming an advocate in your community for the adoption of Marketo, or just whatever you're doing internally to really set yourself up as that advocate type of role. And that's sort of the questions that they'll ask you in the application process. When you actually submit an application, the next step would be to get called in for an interview, and it's really a panel interview discussion with the Marketo customer advocacy team. And they just sort of ask you to explain a little bit more about the questions that you answered in your application, why you would be a good fit for the champion program, and then pretty much go from there with next steps and finding out if you're a champion. So it's been a great opportunity for me. It's getting to network with all of these wonderful women on the call and all the other champions that we have from across the world. Just getting to learn from the best of the best, the people who've used the tool for so long, have used really interesting applications of it. So I very much recommend you guys giving it a shot if it's something that you're interested in. And if you have questions about it, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us directly as you're thinking about going through that process.
Yeah, that was awesome, Courtney. Thanks. That's a great way to recap it. The other thing that I'll say too, being involved in the program is just, you mentioned it, but just to really, really piggyback off it is enhancing my skill set, right? Like there's so many things I didn't know unless I asked people who are kind of in the same mess that we're in every day.
For sure.
Or sometimes it's not a mess, but very rarely is that the case. Yeah. So I think it's really great just to be involved and to learn from everybody. So that's awesome. So now we'll get a little bit more into the weeds. That would be a great intro to do about the champion program, but now some Marketo specific questions. So Carrie, I'll start with you on this one. We've had a lot of questions about integrations. So whether they're native or custom, so what add-ons or integrations in Marketo have made the biggest impact for you in your career working in the platform?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you'll find a lot of variance just depending on the business and the company and the needs. And I think that's one of the first things to start with is another company might have a really cool integration with a really cool platform. Doesn't necessarily mean that it'll fit your needs. So always, take a look at what you're trying to solve with your business. But the couple of things that have really helped us and propelled how we market and how we think about marketing operations have been custom APIs with our website. So we have a very transactional customer base where they come on and they are getting quotes from us. They're submitting business to us on our website. So that's been a critical point for us to understand who is completing those actions, information that we can gather about them, and then be able to trigger really important marketing touch points off of that data. So anytime you can learn more about especially your customers, but generally just kind of your lead or customer database and those critical points of interaction, awesome. So that's been a really important one. And then other two that I think about are video integration. So we use Vidyard as an example. There are other tools out there, and that's been really critical because again, for our business, we have a lot of video content. And so understanding who is accessing those videos, to what extent they're completing those videos, and then being able to trigger marketing communications or sales notifications off of the completion of that kind of watching of the video has been really, really helpful for us. And then direct mail. So again, a lot of providers out there, we've personally used PFL, but when you think about the end experience for that customer or that lead, in being able to, capture that they ordered something from you or claimed something from you, giving them their tracking number, letting them know that it's been delivered, triggering a touch point over to sales to let them know to follow up with that person. Like when you can create really holistic journeys that's exactly the type of integration that we look for and that has really helped us.
Yeah, those are great, Carrie. I know when you mentioned a couple of, some names that you have used or some vendors, and this is either to you, Carrie, or anybody else on the panel, are most of those native integrations where you just kind of have to connect through LaunchPoint and you have the login and username credentials, or is it more of a custom like API integration approach?
Yeah, I'd say ours are a combination of the two. We always look for LaunchPoint partners because that's the easiest thing to do. But we're open to custom integrations, just understanding that if that's the right platform for us and we need to make that work, great. But we do tend to look for LaunchPoint partners.
Yeah, and I know that, in my experience too, I think a lot of you guys can kind of chime in there too, is sometimes it's hard to identify a custom integration, right? And there's a lot of development work that has to happen. A project plan, it takes a lot longer. So I definitely agree. For those of you who are learning integrations, try, if you're doing vendor selection, look for those who are native with Marketo, because a lot of times it's going to be easier down the road, and you'll save some money and revenue on whatever you purchase. But I think those are some great overviews of that, Carrie. Thank you. So we have another one about some A/B testing. So we actually talked about this during the icebreaker, so it's a great transition. So we have someone asking about A/B testing program strategy for nurture. They want more of like a technical perspective, like how would you set it up, and more strategic, like what types of things do you test for A/B? And I know Jenn, you had a session on this for the Adobe Summit. So I kind of throw the question off to you to see if you want to answer that question for the audience member.
Yeah, so I guess the quick down and dirty answer is that my Marketo buddy, Jess Cow, and I did do a summit session on this just this past year. So we can get that link to you guys probably after this, but we went through the whole spiel, like here's what you need to think of from a strategy standpoint, and here's how you set it up in Marketo. But just a really quick overview so that you have something to go on. Our big recommendation is to potentially not test in your actual nurture. Sometimes, especially if you want results that are statistically significant and you have the appropriate sample size, you want to do that as like a batch and blast, see what works in the test, and then put it in your nurture. Really, it comes down to data. How many people are you sending to? How long is the nurture up and running? And the thing with nurture is that your sends kind of vary over time. Like 1 week it might go to 200 people, the next week it might go to like 5 people, just because you have different people whose data is constantly changing. That's why we recommend doing it as kind of like a once like batch and blast. However, if you do need to implement it, Marketo does have some limitations on that, and that limitation is you have to use champion challenger on the email asset, and then you can just set it up like a regular A/B test. So that's really, I think, the biggest technical thing is just there are some things that you can use versus others when you want to go and implement that. It really comes down to the strategy and the data when all is said and done.
That's great. Now, do you normally do the, like when you mentioned A/B testing, when you do like the batch and blast approach, do you use the A/B testing feature in Marketo, or do you guys do your own type of approach to it? What have you found successful?
I tend to prefer sending emails out of default programs, but the email send program tends to be a little easier because you can automate the A/B test, right? Like you can say, like, here's our winning criteria, send it to, the first 1,000 people, whichever wins, then send it to the rest. Whereas if you send it in a default program, you actually have to go in and declare the winner. So I think in that case, it kind of depends how much time do you have on your hands to go and do that. And I think that's a personal preference. But yeah, if you want it a little bit more automated, then do the email send.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know there's a lot of different ways to do it, so it's helpful to hear, what you've had success with. So speaking to emails and A/B testing, I know there's a lot about predictive content. So it's another question that we had come through, and since it kind of goes into play, I'm going to shoot this over to Megan first, but it looks like Carrie probably also can chime in as well. But Megan, have you used predictive content in emails, or dynamic segmentations and dynamic content? And if so, do you have like some use cases you could share?
Yeah, definitely. So we use Content AI, which is an add-on that you can purchase with Marketo, and this allows you to create custom content streams. So you can upload specific content based on a specific topic, and then you can enable that stream to show inside of your email. And the really cool part about Content content AI is that it predicts which assets it feels like the person would be most likely to read or like within your stream. So it's super dynamic and flexible, but at the same time, you can choose the content that is displaying in your emails. So that is super nice. And then we also do use segmentations and just normal dynamic content inside of emails too, based on industry or job title or any other criteria that we want to come up with.
Awesome. And have you guys seen, so it probably was different to try something new, right? How did you go about trying a new feature in Marketo? Did you test it with a small sample audience first, or did you have to chat with other stakeholders?
Yeah, we definitely had to chat with other stakeholders when we were implementing it, just because we wanted to make sure that there are enough assets in the rotation for content AI, as well as just making sure that we are uploading the correct assets to the streams. So we definitely tested on more like emails that's sent to a larger audience versus a smaller audience at first, so we can get more data behind it and see how people are actually engaging with the content. And then from there, we kind of narrowed it down to more specific industry-based or job title-based segmentation. So.
Yeah, that's great. Having those like solid barriers of why, right? You mentioned job title segmentations, audience segmentations, that type of stuff is really great to be able to differentiate. So if you guys have use cases, it's probably nice. So Carrie, I know that you also have some experience on this or using dynamic content pieces. Do you have any case studies or anything additional that you could share beyond what Megan shared?
I mean, I think Megan made some great points, especially when it comes to ramping up a new piece of Marketo, or which is kind of a new tactic that you're going to be using. So we had a similar experience with content AI. We said, we think we have a really good use case for this. We have, 70, 80 plus pieces of video content that are really courses that our customers can take. And so instead of us trying to figure out after somebody's taken X course, they should take Y course, why don't we use content AI to kind of self-deliver what courses they might be interested in next? So we had a couple of global emails that would be sent after a completion of a course. And so we used those emails because they didn't go to our full database, but they went to an engaged piece of our database as our kind of testing ground to add in content AI options to deliver, hey, this course might be good for you, just so we could see, if people would be willing to check those out and move forward with them. And that's been a good testing ground for us in content AI.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it looks like we even have a question in the chat too, a little bit more on what you guys mentioned. So it's from Alexander, and I'm going to relay it the best that I can, but if you want to come off mute at all, you can as well. But it looks like they're asking, so for predictive content based on AI or segmentation, what sort of improvements are you seeing over simple content? And I think this is key here, the second question. What sort of infrastructure integrity did you find necessary to power segmentation-based content? I think that's a good one because it reminds me of data, right? If your data is not there. So do you guys have, and this is open to anybody in the panel, but I know that, Carrie and Megan, you talked a little bit more about it. Do you guys have any advice there? And then also how you measured your success?
Yeah, so as I was kind of mentioning, in terms of data, you can create custom streams with custom tagging. So in terms of like having data behind it, you can say, oh, I only want my healthcare list to see healthcare specific content or something along those lines. And then in terms of metrics, we were definitely looking at click-through rate because it was, we wanted to see how many click-throughs we were getting on our actual email, since you're not seeing content AI until you actually open it. So definitely looking at click-through rates.
That's great. Yeah, anything else to add from anybody who's used segmentations before?
This is more just like segmentations and dynamic content overall. But one thing we've seen, so my marketing operations team, we operate in like a centralized model. So basically all the campaign managers will put their requests into an intake form and we actually execute on them. We go to market by vertical. So we kept seeing the same sort of request over and over and over again, with maybe just a few sentences like specific to a vertical, or different accounting systems listed per vertical. And so my team has leveraged dynamic content to really just drive efficiency in the way that we build programs. You're able to consolidate what would have been like 5 to 6 separate email builds just into one using our vertical segmentation, and still drive the level of personalization that they were hoping to achieve. So that's been great time savings for my team.
Yeah, and that's all about it, right? It's time saving. So
Right.
whatever your team can do quicker and more efficient, that's kind of what the most
Exactly.
people are behind. So one last question on this for those of you who've done content AI and segmentation, any advice on which one's better and why?
For content AI, there is that AI component behind it. So whereas dynamic content, you're actually choosing like this audience sees this specific content and you kind of lay it all out very black and white, you know who's getting what. For content AI, it is dynamic and the platform and the AI behind it is choosing what the client would be it thinks that the client would be most interested in seeing or interacting with. So I definitely like the AI component behind it just because we can't read people's minds. It's really nice to have a tool kind of predicting what it thinks that the customer would like best.
And I think it also just depends on what your need is. Like to Courtney's point, if you have very specific email content that you need to put in front of somebody, that's not necessarily something that you would kind of toss over to AI. That's something that you want to control and that you would use segmentation for versus, again, if you have kind of a library of content and you just kind of want to see what would stick, or you have some flexibility in what you're delivering to people, then content AI is a good example for that. So I think it just kind of depends on what your needs are, campaign by campaign or more globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's key too. Like you mentioned, I know there's some things, at least for my organization as well, I want to control and I need them to see this. And there's other times where it's learning opportunities too. I'm like, okay, I'm going to, try some type of AI. We don't personally use content AI, but we have something similar. And I like to use those as well because it helps me learn about my audience. Maybe I didn't know something that's relevant to them and I wouldn't have thought to put in front of them. And then we have one last one. Alexander is really into the content AI. So I love this. I will talk about any type of data all day long. So we're good. Last question, he said, in case he missed it, what sort of percentage improvements in click-through rates were you seeing? And then anecdotally after applying the dynamic content. So do you guys have any ballpark numbers of the increase that you had before and after when you were measuring?
I don't know if I have any.
You don't have it memorized
behind it right now. I know, it's crazy.
You don't have it tattooed on your forearm? Yeah, so maybe what we can do is follow up then. I think that's a great question. Alexander, maybe we can do is follow up with you and do some use cases, but those are some great questions. So thank you. So kind of going a little bit into, you're just talking about segmentation. So it reminded me of leads. So for lead partitions, it's another one that we had that I'm going to pass over to Courtney. We actually had somebody just asking in general, like, what are lead partition best practices?
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple of things to consider when you want to set up different partitions. A lot of it is like how your business sort of is set up in the back end. So my company, we have two separate partitions that actually are integrated into two separate CRM instances. So we have a buyer side of our business and a supplier side of our business. And they're two separate databases, two separate Salesforce instances. So we made the decision to bring two separate partitions into Marketo because there really wasn't a reason for them to overlap. They needed to continue to stay separate databases. So because of that, it made sense to set them up as a partition. Another use case I've seen is when there's been like different business units, or say you are a bigger brand that has a lot of like sub brands with separate databases as well, or you want one subset to get messaging for a certain product and another subset to get messaging for another product, then that might make sense as well to have separate partitions. But there are things you probably need to consider when you're setting this up. So because of the different partitions we have set up, we've also set up individual workspaces that are associated to those partitions to help sort of run, the core center of excellence, best practice templates that are needed for like the branding for the different workspaces and partitions that we have set up as well. And also like manage your preference center. So there are sometimes in our use case, we have some overlaps between the buyer database and the supplier database. So we actually have a global preference center that we set up in our center of excellence workspace to look for an unsubscribe that has happened maybe on the buyer side. We're also unsubscribing them on the supplier side partition. So there are definitely level of nuances that you need to think through. Marketo by default does not allow for duplications between partitions either, but because of our unique business case that I was just describing, we actually reached out to Marketo support and they were able to enable those duplicates. So just there are pros and cons to how setting it up that way for sure. But we found it to be very helpful because it's just allowed us to more cleanly manage the data and the way that our business overall manages that data without having to have two completely separate instances of Marketo.
That's great. I like that little nugget about how they could duplicate the leads. That's something I
Yeah.
did not know.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. So yeah, I know that there's a lot of, at least in my experience, there's been a lot of confusion around, people always say workspaces and partitions together. They really are true separate things, right? So I think it's great that we really talked about lead partitions, because lead partitions are the buckets of people, right? And workspaces are, the assets. So I think it's great that you kind of give some examples, because a lot of people don't want to have two Marketo instances. It's nice just to have a consolidated version. So that's great.
Especially when you're running like a centralized marketing operations model. Like for my team, it did not make sense to have separate, completely separate Marketo instances. Like my team manages and runs it all for our entire business. So we only have one place we need to log into, and we can really just execute out of one best practice templates area and drive everything that we need in one space. So it's really allowed us to be flexible and build a use case that works best for us in our day-to-day. And that's one of the nicest things I think about Marketo is a lot of the other marketing automation platforms out there don't even give you that flexibility. You would have to have two separate instances of HubSpot. So it's very nice that they have this capability.
And one bill to pay, right?
Yeah,
don't have to still to be charged for the same thing twice. But yeah, that's some great use cases. So thank you. And I always think of compliance too. And now, I think of compliance of sharing the leads and making sure you can control who gets the messages. So speaking of compliance, email deliverability, GDPR, all that stuff comes to mind. So for deliverability, it looks like we have a question about how you can tell, like before you're about to send an email, how can you ensure that it's going to be a healthy send? A good deliverability rate. So Jen, I'm going to pass that one over to you. Do you have any suggestions on how to make sure it's a good email send?
Sure. Kind of like with anything else, as simple as time and money. The biggest advice I give people, and I know it's not, the quickest type of answer, is to really just make sure that your database is clean. I know, we run into a lot of scenarios where maybe the data is really legacy. So we're getting a bunch of, email not available, error 500 sort of things where we just can't reach those people, which, hits your deliverability. So making sure that you're spending the time to cleanse your database as frequently as possible, set aside some time at the end of every quarter. The week between Christmas and New Year's, if you don't take time off, is a great time to do that because nobody's really bothering you. But as far as, some other stuff that you can do, I've used email and acid, litmus, the standard type of things where you can dump your HTML in there and make sure that there aren't spammy words, your subject line's not spammy, how long it might take to read through your email. And then you can actually get metrics on how long people are taking to scroll through your email and just make sure all your links are good and things like that. So those have been very handy, but again, it is an additional cost and an implementation too. You have to make sure your code is right. So just a heads up there. That's really my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah. No, I think those are some great platforms you mentioned too. I know a lot of us have experience doing this. It looks like we have a mention or a question upon that, Jen. So somebody mentioned that we've observed if we use text tokens in our email headers, the deliverability rate is very low. Have any of you guys encountered that before?
I personally, to be honest, have not used text tokens in my pre-headers in a while. I want to say like most of the people that I've worked with recently have moved away from doing that. Whether it was for deliverability purposes, I can't say, but I do know like most of the people that I've worked with don't really do that too frequently anymore.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. Does anybody else use tokens in your pre-headers or your headers for emails at all? No. Yeah, I would say, I guess just from my perspective, maybe like all things, test it, right? Maybe have, two separate email assets where you test one with the pre-headers and test it without. You mentioned the deliverability rate is already maybe lower, but maybe just make sure that that is truly the case, that it's the text tokens first, and then you can kind of address it from there. That's a good point. Thanks for chiming in. So we had a lot of questions about the Apple mail privacy protections. We're going to open up that can of worms right now. So we had a lot of them come in. A lot of you guys said you could answer it. So Jen, since you just mentioned about the email deliverability, do you want to start first about your approach on that news and how you guys are encountering it?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be not a battle, but maybe a little bit of a struggle, because especially when a lot of your reports are based on open rates, this is really going to throw people for a loop. The nice thing with Marketo is that you can track so many other things that actually have people's actionable data behind it. So you can use that instead to report on, open rates for the past, I don't know, at least 5 years have been almost useless in my reports due to bots. Like bots are clicking on opening those emails like crazy. Actual people aren't behind those. So I've been recommending for the past few years that people try to move forward to like web page visits or actual conversions to try and measure the effectiveness versus the actual open rate. So if you do move more toward that model, this might not impact you as much. And I think that's really a huge shift in thinking and operations and things like that, that it is going to be a little bit of a struggle, but I feel like that's really the only way to keep pushing forward with that.
I would agree. We encounter it every day, right? Changes, enhancements, technology is always changing. So I think that's a great point. Carrie, you might have mentioned that you also have some experience with this, maybe not so much from the technical side, but some experiences you've had. Do you want to share those?
Plus one to everything Jen just said. I think the biggest thing is focusing on the communication internally that you have and the expectations that you set internally with what you want to see from a campaign and what you're going to be measuring. I think to Jen's point, open metrics, even click metrics to a certain extent, they can be totally skewed by either bot activity. I think also just understanding that, like, depending on your audience, right, you can manipulate an audience to really drastically change your open and click rates. And I think ultimately what we've been pushing for to help alleviate, I think this first change with Apple and more changes that will probably happen in the next couple of years, is to shift the conversation to, look, here's our total audience and here's the ultimate conversion that we're expecting to get. And we're going to have multiple tactics employed, email being one of them, to get us to that point. So let's look at the overall program success, and then we can take a look back at our individual tactics, and that can help inform decisions on, if we use these tactics again, but trying to really level up to the program success and the overall conversion, to Jen's point.
Yeah, no, that's all good stuff. I agree. And I think that it's just something we have to keep coming up with, right? Different our strategies and our approaches to it. And I always say, like, every business is different. I know you guys mentioned reporting metrics on a lot of our dashboards. Personally, we don't report on that. So it doesn't affect us as much, but it depends on, as an email admin, of course, you're going to be reporting on that because you want to see it. So those are all really great points. And we did have a question from Kevin related to emails. So has anyone enabled the email bot activity in admin?
I did. So we enabled it, and it does block some things, but not all. We were still noticing a lot of bot activity, and for whatever reason, we are the chosen ones, and they're also triggering web page visits. So it's been doing a whole bunch of fun stuff. So we actually implemented our own on top of it. I think it does work for the specific IP addresses that it targets, but they have to be IP addresses that are on a specific list. It's in the documentation, like what is on that actual list, and not the actual IPs, but what it kind of includes, if you want to take a look at that. But I will say, like, I would say it blocks maybe like 30% of our bots.
I've had the same experience. We enabled it for email and for the forms, and it's definitely blocking some, but a lot are still very sneaky and still getting through. Although it does sound like we just had our Marketo call with the product team. It sounds like they're continuing to iterate on it. So I'm very excited to see what comes out in the next wave.
Me too.
Yeah, personally, we had the same experience. So it sounds like we're all pretty concurrent there. Block some, but not all. And we have our own on top of it as well. So yeah, I would love to, maybe in our next office hours, we see if it's gotten better whenever they release it. I would love to do some comparison. So that's a really good question. So we have some other questions. We have some more technical ones that I'll get to in a minute, but we do have one just about nurture campaigns in general. So Carrie, I'm going to pass this one over to you. Someone just asked, how do they create an effective B2B nurture campaign? So it's a pretty open-ended question. So I think that's a great example for you to talk through it.
Very open-ended, but that's kind of good, because when you're thinking about starting a nurture campaign, again, always think about what your ultimate goal is and then work backwards from there. So let's say, for example, that your goal is to get demo requests out of a B2B nurture. I think, again, from there, you can start to work backward and think about your personas and your segmentations and what kind of content would kind of fit that funnel of the nurture to eventually lead to that ultimate request. Something that we've also tried to do with our nurtures that we found pretty effective is to layer in some secondary calls to action. So, along the way in a nurture, maybe you have an ebook that's being delivered, and that's kind of the main purpose of that email. But within that email, you have additional CTAs to request that demo, to kind of skip ahead in the nurture and provide those additional calls to action. So kind of think about, again, the people that you're supposed to be marketing to, what kind of content aligns, spacing out that content, thinking about the timing. That's something else to play around with, is how often should your emails be going out? Is it a week in between? Is it 2 weeks? Is it more or less? Play around with some of those things just to find out what works for your audience, and then layer in those additional CTAs so that you're not waiting until the very end to try to get that conversion. But again, you can, if somebody's on the hook, you can let them go ahead and try to convert earlier.
Those are some great examples. I love those. And I know in B2B marketing, it's so different too for each types of marketing. So I think it's great to kind of start there. Any other suggestions too on particular use cases on nurture campaigns? Well, it looks like you did it all, Carrie.
Oh,
Nobody.
I was going to say,
Courtney has something to say now. Now we have something.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, we've tried to take it an approach that really meets our life cycle model that we've built out. So we truly have a nurture for almost every stage of life cycle, and the length of the cadence and the messaging and the CTA is very different based off of where they're at. So like a top of the funnel one, more informative, more helping them learn more about our company, our solutions, not asking for a demo. But once they hit that MQL level and maybe haven't converted, that's when we're trying to give them case studies, videos that soft demo our product, really trying to push for that, getting that meeting actually scheduled. So yeah, I would definitely suggest looking at your overall life cycle and talking to your sales team as well, like especially once they hit that MQL or opportunity stage, how can you continue to feed them content that might help them move to that next stage of their journey?
Yeah, those are great examples as well. And we do have a question. I think it's from Ashu, and I'm so sorry if I mistake your name, but hopefully I got it right. But we have a question, and I think this is good because I selfishly want to know as well. So do you guys do smart campaigns for adding and transitioning members and streams, or do you guys use the transition rules? Open up to anybody. Smart campaigns.
Smart campaigns, 100%.
Smart campaigns.
Smart campaigns.
One, because I'm super anal retentive about having control over that sort of thing, I guess you could say, but also because you can run reports off the smart campaigns. And if you're doing a buyer's journey sort of transition, you can track the velocity a little easier. That way you can see how many people are moving from one stream to another. So that's really my favorite reason.
Anybody else? Everybody else do smart campaigns?
Yeah.
Yeah. Looks like we have a pretty wide vote here, and it looks like we have some people chiming in saying smart campaigns too. So I personally do them as well. I was just curious what everybody else did. So yeah, those are some great questions on nurture. I'm going to do a couple more kind of high level questions, and I'll get into some technical questions if that's cool with everybody. So the next one I have is how to position Marketo for a small business. So Courtney, I'm going to pass that one over to you.
Sure. This is a great question. This is actually how I started learning Marketo. I was a marketing department of one. We did a little RFP and decided we needed a marketing automation platform, and Marketo was it. And one thing I would say that was very quickly a big learning curve for us was very hard for the rest of the business to truly understand the value add of marketing automation. I think we really were honing in on the email service provider components of it and really just using it as a glorified email tool. So I would start out by trying to differentiate what an email service provider is versus a marketing automation platform, and truly trying to build out that strategy. So trying to figure out your life cycle model, how you can build out lead nurturing programs that will help drive leads through your funnel. What reports do you want to share out that can help tell the broader story of a tool like Marketo besides this opens and clicks that we were talking about? The other thing that I think this applies, whether it's a small business or a large business, is really I would focus on building out some best practice templates. As soon as you get more than one person in that tool, everyone's doing different programs and they have their specific way they like to build it, or they like to get creative with the banners that they put in your emails. Like a best practice template ensures that everyone is being consistent across the board. So whether you have 5 people in there or 100 people in there, you're making sure that your programs are getting tracked for if they actually influence, if they engaged with your webinar tactic, or they're using the same branding consistently across the board. So that's sort of what I would suggest from a small business, is truly trying to take advantage of the full technology rather than just using it for email, and trying to get some consistency in how you're using the tool.
I love that. And I think I still, and I'm sure a lot of you can share this, I still get the question on like, Marketo just sends our emails, right? And it just makes you cringe. And I love that that's the first thing you mentioned, because Marketo is an expensive tool. And for a small to mid-sized business, you want to make sure you have, the cost effectiveness for why you have it. So that's perfect. Thanks for that answer. That's awesome.
For sure.
So we'll get into some technical ones now. I'm going to kind of drill you guys with some tech questions. So we're going to start off with some APIs here, some questions about APIs and webhooks. So Megan, I'm going to shoot this one over to you. Do you have any best practice or any suggestions on when to use webhooks versus APIs and what your experience is with that?
Yeah, definitely. So webhooks, this is a very technical question, but I found that webhooks are mostly used when you're trying to receive data and they're more event-based. So one example that we use a webhook for is for ZoomInfo. As a lead is synced into our CRM, we want to grab the information from ZoomInfo, enrich that lead so the sales teammate actually has that information. So that's one example of a webhook that we use, but there's tons of examples out there. And then for APIs, just kind of comparing the two, APIs require you to have a request. So you're kind of putting in a request and then you're receiving a response from that request that you put in. So those are more commonly used, at least in my experience, when there's data that's constantly changing and you're constantly needing to retrieve that data and get it into your instance over and over again. So yeah, I would say there are some similarities, but also some differences from them. And it just really depends on your use case and the data that you're trying to get into Marketo.
I would agree. That makes sense. We do a lot of different varieties of that as well. It's all about the use cases, right? Like I always don't really think of the solution first. Think of like, what does success look like? Not what is the solution. That really helps our team kind of map out how we work as well. So this one's more about a specific piece of Marketo that comes, Marketo Engage that we have. So Marketo Sales Insight, I know a lot of people have used that before. So Carrie, I'm going to pass this one to you. Do you have any best practices that you can talk through about Marketo Sales Insight that you've implemented?
Well, the first is organizational, and that's just getting aligned with your sales team, right? There's always, I feel like with everything, alignment with your sales team is really important. So things like your lead scoring model and what you're capturing as interesting moments are really key to align with them, because that's what they're going to see. That's what's going to drive what they see in MSI. When they're viewing it, that's what's going to drive the stars and flames. So that's what's worked best for us. We've focused on the lead score and the interesting moments as kind of our main points of collaborating with the sales team. And you don't want to be triggering interesting moments if that's not being looked at and if that doesn't really matter to what the sales team needs. But also when you think about what interesting moments are going to be showing up, thinking about naming conventions and how they can be displayed in a way that sales can understand them. I've seen some examples of interesting moments that wouldn't mean a single thing to anybody who doesn't, know the ins and outs of Marketo. So keeping that in mind of just like A, coming to a decision on what you're going to be tracking and how that lead scoring model works. And then B, when you do surface that information to sales within MSI, what that needs to look like in order for it to be effective for them. And then the other thing to think about is sales training and sales usership. So if you're either just starting to use MSI or you've tried it before, but sales hasn't really kind of taken it and run with it yet, find a couple of people to pilot it and to be kind of your buddies on it, and have a couple of use cases where they've seen success from using MSI, and have them be, again, kind of your buddies to help the other members of the sales team really begin to adopt the tool.
Adoption is key. I completely agree with you there, especially with our buddies on sales. So that's a good one. So another one is, this is a very particular case. So Jen, I'm going to pass this one over to you. So it looks like somebody here they're at a starting point of 150,000 leads that are potential invalid or bad member records from their database. So how do you think this person should go about starting the purge of all these people?
A great purge. Yeah, I mean, first of all, my number one tip would be, if you're going to purge that data, purge it from both your databases, the CRM and the marketing automation platform. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that first. You heard it here first. But as far as going through that list, I mean, to ensure that they're actually bad, a lot of times the email address will be bad, but the contact isn't necessarily. Either they, in my scenario, for example, I get married, I change my name, maybe my email changes and someone doesn't forward the email correctly, then, the email is going to be bad. So you have to take into those types of use cases where the email might be bad, but the contact is good. So what I like to do is take a look at, the activities that the person has performed, because even if the email is bad, maybe they have some activity tied to that cookie when they're visiting pages and stuff. See if they're visiting any specific web pages, see maybe what type of bounce errors they're getting, because they might be bouncing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the email is actually bad. It just means like their inbox is full, or there was a server error in their company, or for whatever reason you're hitting spam. So there's a possibility there that sales can reach them with an individual email. You just can't, because you're sending from a platform that is known to be a mass email provider. So I think that for me, it's like running a bunch of smart lists to start with, all of the different bounce errors, seeing what happens to those, any types of activities, and taking it from there.
So they don't just delete them all out right away and do nothing, no kind of research?
Yeah, I mean, I would consider quarantining them if you see that they're impacting your deliverability rate, like maybe suppress them from that while you're figuring that out. But,
I laugh because we've all had those people that we've worked with, right? I've worked with somebody before where they're like, well, they just look bad. And I'm like, why? they're not opening my emails. Okay, well, it's not bad data. So I'm happy that you do the research ahead of time. So it looks like we have about 8 minutes left. I want to get into some more general questions. We had a lot of questions on like, I'm new to Marketo. How do I learn? How do I learn the programs and the platforms inside out? So I'm going to start with you, Carrie, on one of these questions, but honestly, we've all learned it before. We all train people. So everybody feel free to chime in. But what's the best way for somebody who's brand new to learn Marketo and to really enhance their skill set?
Yeah. Well, being here is a good first step, right? Like leveraging the community. That's awesome. Marketo has the free online university courses that give you an opportunity to learn and then actually practice and kind of do what they're teaching. So those are good, again, free resources. Mugs, which Chelsea mentioned in the beginning, are a great place to not only learn, but to meet people that you can bounce ideas off of and say like, hey, can you take a look at this thing that I built in my instance, and just get a second set of eyes or a different opinion. So it's a really great community builder. There are also communities on LinkedIn and Slack that you can find related to either Marketo or marketing operations. And then the biggest thing is to test and to actually practice and get in the tool, right? The best way to learn is to do. And so if you have the flexibility and the time to get in, one of the things that I did when I was first learning is when somebody came to me and said, hey, we need to do this campaign or we need to do this thing, I would practice building it out, but then I'd also think about what are the other possible ways that this could have been built or could have been managed, just so that I help myself understand the different avenues and why there are kind of pros and cons to either one. So leverage the community, Marketo university courses, and then get in there and just try building things out.
I love the just try and do. That's great. I agree. You're not going to learn unless you have a testing scenario or something to implement. Those are great topics. Thank you. Anybody else have anything that they suggest, either how you learned or how you train your team?
I always really benefited from like reading the product docs, just reading through line by line, pretty much any new situation you're going to have while you're learning Marketo. There's a product doc that will walk you through step A through Z. And I think that was like a good way to sort of practice what Carrie was preaching, what just doing, but still sort of having a guide. Like I would often try the build on one of my screens while having the product doc up on my other screen as like a safety net as well. So I really recommend just reading through those. And also if you're studying for the Marketo Certified Expert exam or even the Certified Associate, a lot of those little questions live directly within the product doc. So it doesn't hurt to read those things.
Yeah, and they do have a lot of gotchas in them too that I honestly still learn
For
being
sure.
what 7+ years in, where I forget something and they have like, I think it's like highlighted in green because I always see it. It's like the tip. So yeah, those are great. The product docs I send to people all the time. We did have a question. You mentioned the Marketo Certified Expert exam, the Adobe Practitioner exam. Now there was a question about level of HTML. Looks like somebody's trying to get certified. Do you guys know, in your experience, is there any type of level of HTML needed to succeed and pass the exam?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jen. Somebody was going to say something.
Yeah, like to me, it's kind of useful just to have in your everyday life, but you don't need it to know how Marketo works and how things should be applied and things like that.
Yeah, those are great ways to explain it. Sometimes it's just easier to kind of fix it quickly than to go to like a front end developer. Save some time on everybody's hands. But yeah, let's just say when I first took the exam, I did not know HTML and I passed. So I think we'll be okay. And it looks like we have another from Thaddeus in the chat. I love the mentor piece. So we have a mention where he said, find a mentor, and yes, do. So a lot of the connections on LinkedIn, I do know there's a lot of great mentorship, opportunities out there as well. I know a lot of companies are starting to invest in mentors. I wish I had a mentor when I was younger that knew, Marketo really well, and you can kind of bounce some ideas and questions off of them. So I think that's a great point that he kind of brings along. Another question, high level, about the platform is how does it differentiate from competitors? So that's a good question. And I feel like I get it all the time, especially when I was in the agency space. So Jen, you come from an agency background. Do you have any suggestions on how to explain how Marketo is better than other competitors?
In my experience, there are a few things that set it apart. One is that the sync to Salesforce is pretty great. Like the way that you set up fields and the user stuff, like if you add a new field, it'll just sync right over because of the user permissions that your Marketo user has. Whereas in other platforms, you have to recreate the field and then map it, and it becomes this whole process. Another thing that has frustrated me with some other providers is that their dynamic lists aren't necessarily dynamic. If there's a lot of data that's processing, they'll be like, we'll send you an email when this is done. Whereas in Marketo, you might get like, a brief spinning wheel of death while the list loads, and it pops up and it's right there for you. But I think really the biggest thing for me are the local program tokens. I feel like a lot of us would not be here if not for them. It saved our butts in a lot of cases and time as well. Because I remember the days where it would take hours to build an email, whereas now, it might take 10, 15 minutes. So I really think that that's the biggest differentiator for me.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that you've had a lot of experience in all of them. So thank you for that insight. It's really helpful for everybody here.
I would also add, one more. Marketo it's awesome as well because you can clone the entire program, where a HubSpot or a Pardot, I believe you have to actually clone the individual assets. So that's just another huge time savers as well.
That hurts.
Nobody got time for that.
Exactly.
That's how I feel about it. We're busy people. So
yeah.
This is really great, you guys. I see we're almost at the top of the hour, so I want to give everybody a chance to breathe if you have another meeting. But thank you guys so much for your conversations, the questions. I even learned a lot today from all of you lovely ladies. So this was great. And everybody, thanks for spending the time. And remember, we'll send out some slides and recordings and have some resources for you. So go enjoy your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.